you don't just have to engage curiosity for the sake of learning the thing to check a box, right? That like actually curiosity is this muscle that you have to flex. And then once you realize, you're like, oh my God, being a human being and getting to learn stuff is like basically one of the great privileges of consciousness. I think a lot of really great teachers really do make that their life's goal, is not to teach any particular thing, but just to say like, oh my gosh, can I get students to actually really enjoy just engaging the learning part of their brain? Because actually students will be fine if that thing's turned on. But yeah, doing so in a way that makes it feel like students realize they can apply that to anything, even things that aren't curriculum.
Welcome to the Unrulr podcast, where we talk to educators and learners creating the future of learning. I'm your host, Aaron Shorn, an educator who loved the tool so much I joined the company. And today I'm joined by Danny Rankin. Danny is a teaching assistant professor in the Atlas Institute at CU Boulder, and is kind of a resident tinkerer and badass in the world of education. Danny, welcome to the most prolific podcast in education technology here at Unrulr.
Hey, thanks for having me. This is great.
Oh, absolutely. Danny, the first question I always ask is, what's your philosophy of education?
Yeah, so for me, I think that I grew up in kind of a non-traditional educational background. I drifted between public schools and private schools and home schools and charter schools and stuff, mostly because my parents moved a lot. And a lot of what I got educationally was just sort of like by being in shop spaces where professional people were making stuff. My parents were self-employed carpenters, sign painters, and I kind of started working for them. And it wasn't until later that I realized that so much of what I actually learned was not from kind of sitting in a classroom, but just by making projects and kind of putting my hands on tools and seeing that. And when I kind of like, fast forward to getting into actually teaching in the university, realize that a lot of students get really disenfranchised with sitting in a classroom, or even with the kind of creative work that's solely digital, just on a computer, as opposed to actually the kind of embodied physicality of making, just stuff that you can touch and you can actually feel the materials it's made out of. So I think that for me, the biggest part of that educational vision that I have is just getting students the opportunity to engage their whole self sensorially in what they're doing, rather than just saying like, all right, engage your mind, yes, engage your eyes, yes, but also your ears and your body and your sense of smell and taste and all of the things that happen there. And I think that's what I've been trying to chase down, is like, how do we get students just using their whole model of learning that comes from kind of using physical tools in a wood shop, or building kind of strange things, or folding up pieces of paper rather than just making stuff on a screen? And does that enhance the overall kind of accessibility of their learning experience? And although I don't have any hard data on it, I find that, at least anecdotally, yeah, it does. So I've been trying to chase that down in a lot of ways.
Oh, I've been on that chase too. Like that fever dream of a chase to figure out how not to mess up my learning environment, right? To make it that authentic, like, mentor-mentee, I'm building something. There is a purpose and relevance to this skill, right? And school, whether it's higher ed or high school or middle school, just constantly gets in the way of these really powerful relationships and moments too. Like, what's your how? Like, how are you doing that at
so
at
I mean,
Atlas?
it's like a kind of a dream that we get students that already self-identify as wanting to sort of do it differently. And almost every class in this space is all project-based stuff. So whether that's computer programming projects, whether that's physical installations of artwork projects, whether that's just building a table or a pair of shoes or something like that, I feel really thankful that for me, that model of education is almost like the whole. It's like how they're like, yes, this is actually what's working for students. They're really liking it. So we have all of these different labs they call teaching labs, and the faculty get to chase their own passion, which is what we're interested in creatively or research-wise. And then we get to design classes around that where students just sort of become co-experimenters in those spaces. And I think to that point of like, yeah, school can get in the way a lot of it at the time, or like the administration and that is absolutely true. But
students seem to really respond well when you're like, hey, I have no idea where we're going exactly on this thing, but here's what I'm interested in, here's what my experience is, and here's where I want to take you on that. And students seem to, I don't know, I've been told sometimes like design can't be taught, right? It can only be learned. So in a space where I'm trying to teach design, all you can really do is try and like set these spaces up with enough opportunities and different ways to engage that students can kind of plug in. And thankfully, yeah, it's a lot of like, you know, really creative and kind of exploratory students that are just willing to take risks, and, you know, they want to see what they can produce at the end of the day. So yeah, it's a lot of those just different environments, whether they're big groups of students or whether it's a cluster of 6 or 10 students all working on one controller or game or project or whatever. You know, just making it clear that they have the freedom to come in and mess around, and that we have at least some tools or resources that maybe they haven't engaged with before, that they can also just physically explore and learn and make mistakes with, hopefully without losing a finger or something.
Yeah. There's this theme in like true innovation in education, where innovation is not that like douchey disruption that we hear about all the time in tech,
Yep.
but it's bringing us back to our roots, right? It's bringing us back to how we've always learned, through relationships, through, you know, there's a phrase in Hawaiian, makahana ka'ike, by doing one learns, right? By doing an activity and kind of learning through it too. And I think a lot about Ron Berger, who wrote this book, An Ethic of Excellence. And he talks about artifacts of excellence, like student work that can be way more powerful than anything a teacher or like more knowledgeable other like produces, right? Because it's authentic and it's real, and it's someone else kind of going through this struggle too. And I loved how you framed what you were just talking about. Like when I, as a teacher, am in it with my students, when we're all co-creators together, I might have a little bit more information. I might have like the purse strings to like get more things for us to work on, but I'm in it with you. That totally transforms the learning environment. And, you know, I'm obsessed with, and I'll say this on every podcast, the Soulquarians, this like collective of musicians in the 90s.
Yeah.
Jay Dilla, all of my favorites, Questlove, Erykah Badu, like they came together to make music, right? And they had different skills. How have you seen that collective, that idea of a collective, kind of transform the spaces you're in?
Yeah, it's cool. So I have this one kind of experimental studio we're running this time for the first year of this semester, where we've got a bunch of students who all exhibited like extraordinary talent in graphic design, and just have an aesthetic eye that they've developed over time, but maybe
Super
don't
cool.
get a lot of they don't always get a lot of practice like making a lot of projects from that, because our program, although it has graphic design in it, isn't really focused on that. It's more on kind of like computation and other sorts of kind of artifacts of computers. So this semester I've gotten to run this weird experimental studio we call the Atlas In-House, where we basically take on just challenging communication and graphic design projects and try and make them work. And we've done a bunch of stickers and posters and interesting swag. We also did a full-on stage design for a TEDx event that was happening here at the university, where they built these like giant 4-foot tall paint cans that were spilling like weird things that looked like paint and letters all over the stage.
I saw that on your website. It looks so cool. It looks so cool. We'll throw it in the notes. It's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's just like all of these different avenues that they can kind of produce work. And for me, it's been a real shift, although I'm still managing and directing where they're going with it. Students really are taking the lead on that. I'm going like, okay, you seem interested in this and your idea is strong. Develop the whole idea and tell these other 2 students who are working with you how to kind of execute that project, and I'll get you the materials and the money to build it. And it's been super rewarding to see. I mean, there's this like drawback sometimes with that, where it's like, it's not a traditional client relationship. They're paying to take a class. So I can't treat them like it's like a boss employer relationship, right? The labor relationship's different, because ultimately, whether they produce amazing work or bad work, it's more about whether they engaged with the work, which is different than if I was running a commercial design studio. I'd be like, oh, you produce bad work, you're fired. But in a classroom, I'm not going to fire a student because I want them to grow and learn regardless of how good their work is. So um, it's a little weird there because sometimes I'm like, all right, well, we didn't produce the thing that we needed to produce. Well, moving on. And that's been an interesting challenge. But the students have they show up every day and they just sort of work on things in with an energy I don't see in other classroom environments, because there's so much more freedom for them to run on their own work. And it's cool because they own it more. I don't know how much more. I have like no metrics to put to like how much more they're learning or retaining, but it feels like that weird spark that you can't quite put words to when you're in a class that's like
Totally.
something special is happening. Yeah. That's that feeling. I'm like, oh, they're forming relationships in ways that are going to kind of like supersede the class. There'll be like friends formed in that room that they stay in touch with because of that class, and that they maybe even work with in the future because of that class. And I'm like, yeah, that feels like the kind of metrics that I'm shooting for, is like, are there good relational connections being formed? And does it feel like they're actually gaining perspective as human beings rather than just sort of like information retaining? And it,
I mean, those are two competencies. Like you just listed two competencies. They're not classic competencies, but they are. Like, and I mean, that's the space I'm in with Unrulr, right? Is like all those things that seem impossible to capture. How do we capture them? How do they become metrics of success? Or how do they become the thing that you look at for a successful experience? And so like so much of my work with Jack and others is like, how do we make that qualitative sensory data just as important as the quantitative grade, right? And that gets me to my next question, which is about assessment and feedback. And there's this great quote from Quincy Jones about, he said, when money and music are in the same room, soul leaves the room, right? And I found that when learning and grades are in the same room, like soul leaves the room, right? You're commodifying an experience in metrics that aren't authentic to our learners in any shape and form. But at the same time, I'm obsessed with feedback. I love feedback. Yeah. It's a core part of industry. Editing is a core part of the writing process. Providing feedback is a core part of the mentor-mentee process. And so for me, when I've reframed assessment, whether we're talking about Unrulr or other tools or pedagogies, like when I've reframed it as actionable, relevant feedback that's going to help you as a learner on your project, or feedback from other learners, I've had so much more success in my learning communities. Like how do you do that? How do you embody that? How do you create a culture of assessment or feedback that feels authentic and purposeful?
Yeah, it's really hard because in the university level, there's always this sort of like background pressure. Even if I work in a very cool place, which I do, that doesn't put a lot of pressure on me, the layer above them, which is the sort of bigger university structure, is still like churn students through and get them, the skills they need so they can be employable and like spit them out into the world. And that can be very dehumanizing and soul sucking. And it's really hard to avoid that because there's just that sort of like, it's the air that's sort of surrounding you, is sort of like, get them out the door. We need more students. If you can teach a class with more people in it, then that'd be better. And we can pay you more. And just those kind of perverse pressures that come into play. And assessment becomes that too, because when education becomes so expensive, like it is for higher ed, the kind of like ballooning cost of higher ed, students then have this like, well, I better get a return on my investment. And the only way that I can communicate that traditionally is like, I guess you got a good grade, so that means that you got something out of this, right? Which is kind of the worst. So yeah, the ways that I've tried to subvert that have a lot to do with almost like being really explicit about sort of my flattening of the grading curve, but also the way that I try and say like, hey, I'm going to use these numbers and the way that I talk to you and your feedback and your assignments almost like more harshly than what you would feel in a grade. So like when I teach a graphic design seminar that has 100 students in it, they have a lot of assignments where they're mostly just sort of peer grading and they're mostly just getting feedback from small groups of folks. And whether they do well or not, they're getting some notes from each other on that. And they're kind of getting assessed just on their completion of it. And then I get to do these sort of like occasional critiques of everybody's work where I just rip people to shreds, just so they can kind of feel what that might feel like in a different environment. And I try and preface it. It's almost like I have to be like, I'm out, like I get out of character and I'm like, hey, everybody, I just want to let you know I care about you as people. I'm not doing this to hurt your feelings. I'm now going to look at everyone's work and basically give my honest, unvarnished first-hand opinion of it. And in trying to frame those types of feedback things to say like, hey, I just want to let you know somebody's going to look at your work and think this. So even if, you're actually going to end up with an A on this assignment because you did checked all the boxes, there's more to it than that. And trying to lead students so that they can say, oh, I guess that's an okay way for me to interact with another student, as long as we both feel like there's trust around why we're being critical, then we can engage that more. And I try and lead that from the front, and I try and make it fun and funny. Like a lot of it is sort of like leaning into the almost comedic roasting angle of it. But I also grade their student projects with like a much harsher lens than maybe they're used to. And in general, the notes are usually like, oh, I actually really love that I got meaningful feedback and it helped me figure out how to do that for my peers. So when they produce their posters or whatever, we have tons of different critique methods that we use that try to just make it like less one person standing in the room and looking at the work, and more like we do speed dating critiques where everybody sits in a circle and you just have to give somebody notes. We do like anonymous post-it note critiques where everybody's sticking little comments all over other people's work. And we do some more traditional feedback mechanisms, but yeah, we try and shake it up as much as possible. Just like the ways that you're communicating that sort of feedback, just so that everybody kind of, if you stretch people in what they do there method wise, then you hopefully find a way that resonates with the person where they can be honest and they can actually be critical and be helpful, and that people are able to receive it because it's come in a novel or a new way. And I'm still trying to crack that nut, because a lot of the times you still have a bunch of students that are like, well, it looks good, and they don't want to like give that more specific note, or they haven't put words to it. So more of what I've done in most design classes is just like try and teach them words to give specific input and feedback around projects, and it changes
and so many,
class to class.
So many have been trained and colonized to only put out perfect work, which totally destroys like the creative process, and is like the opposite of industry, right? You have to get out work that isn't perfect, and you have to get critiqued on it. And so, I mean, that super resonates with me. One thing you and I share is having both taught and worked with Jack. And Jack's our director of marketing, and we're an early stage company, so he's everything. Pardon the horrible pun. He's a jack of all trades, if you will. And so, yeah, you can jump off the podcast. That was horrible. I apologize. But like one of the things that Jack taught me was that you have to harness curiosity. And when you do, and you have to show them end products, like what they're going to be able to create. And when you do that, it's almost like you're throwing kind of jet fuel on them learning Adobe, or them learning other elements of graphic design or woodworking or drone flying, right? Because they understand now what is possible. And I take that step further, like the power of communications, human connection, how to write. When you show them what's possible in those spaces, it's there too. Let's just talk about Jack for a little bit. Like, what did you see as you were teaching him? Like, what did you learn from the experience of getting to work with him?
Well, Jack's one of those students that just sort of like leaned in super heavily to the like, oh, I have kind of free reign to do what I want with that. I think that my most vivid memories are Jack being in a class that is it's a class called Material, or we call it Material Studies and Practice. And it's basically a class where I say, here's a bunch of different things that things are made out of. Make a bunch of stuff. Make some stuff out of wood, make some things out of plastic, make some stuff out of fiber, make some stuff out of metal. And that sort of like really robust, just like willingness to try things, but also like still an angle that says, no, I want to try and do my best work here. And I want to pursue, stronger feedback around this and spend time on it, comes through. I think there's always that angle with students that they are in the process of almost deprogramming themselves from kind of a more rigid educational models that we push students through, that are like, do this thing and get this grade and move on to the next level. And ideally in a university setting, you have people that are like, oh no, I don't think that the real world is like that. We're trying to like, oh no, wait, before you go out in the real world, forget everything you've been taught. But Jack was like less in that space. I think he's already kind of like a more free form learner and kind of knows his own learning style. But still, yeah, just going like, all right, what kind of thing do I want to make? What sort of project do I want to produce? And the cool thing about that class is that there's a lot of freedom around the prompts of what gets made, that students just get to sort of go like, all right, I can make this as difficult or as easy as I want, as long as I'm doing the process. And yeah, I think that, Jack had a good lens on both like when it was worth spending tons of hours in the shop perfecting something, and then other times when you're like, yeah, I'm tired and busy and I want to go skiing this weekend or whatever, so I'm just gonna do not the bare minimum, but just sort of like what's necessary to finish it. And that's actually a really huge competency I think that you want adult learners to come out of college with, is like, yeah, I know what's necessary in order to get this across the finish line, and it's okay that I'm just doing that. And then other times when you're like, oh, I'm passionate about this thing and I really want to stretch it. And I think he had a good pulse on that, coming in, as opposed to like finishing the journey with it. Probably, yeah, developing that even more now and over time. That's like a life skill that you grow all the time. But yeah, that's a big one that I'd love to see a learner ready for.
No, I mean that it also helps you figure out what you want to do with the rest of your life, right? It also lets you figure out what you have agency over and where you spend your time. One of my favorite memories is Jack and Hiro Ueno, these two awesome students. I think they just graduated from high school, and I had them as I got some funding from the admissions department to kind of have a team of alumni to go around the island with DJI Inspire drones and just like create really incredible crunchy content, that told the story of the school. And Jack and Hiro picked me up at 4:30 in the morning. And fortunately, Jack, like to say like that a high school student is going to wake up that early is usually rare, but like, in Hawaii, you've got that like, charging the dawn culture of surfing. And so I was lucky to have that in both of them. And we drove to this incredible location. And I will remember it vividly. I know exactly where the drone lifted off. I know like the screams and yells that Jack and Hiro were screaming. I was told by the director of the energy lab not to fly that drone over water. We 100% drew that $4,500 drone over water, flew it rather. Like it was just such a cool experience. Like it was a core memory for me as a teacher, where we were all like just excited and looking at the insane content. And when him and Hiro were cutting that footage together, and we were looking at those pieces, the editing process was so joyful and so a part of that space too. I mean, how else have you made feedback and assessment feel like something we're all in this together for?
Yeah, well, I think with that class in particular, you have a lot of students that sort of almost, so you have students that almost through the process of learning in a particular class realize, oh man, I'm not sure I actually even really want to do this thing, which is sometimes
100%. Totally.
Where they're like, I don't even know that I want to go to the university. Like, one of the students who was also in class with Jack, Toby, was one of those ones where it was this guy who like was good at making stuff, but also was kind of like, I think I might actually want to work in trades, not in like a kind of an academic rooted career or whatever. And trying to just like, regardless of what your outcome that you start to discover, like the path that you want to set yourself on, still engaging in the moment of the class and saying like, okay, how do we fit what you're discovering your desires are into what I'm trying to teach in this class? And then kind of keep people engaged in that way. Say like, hey, I know that maybe you'd rather just go and weld or do metalwork in this thing. Can I have you teach other people that? Can I have you make stuff that other people are going to like get to learn and benefit from? And in some ways it's taking somebody who's maybe like not 100% engaged in the class, but has something to obviously share or offer. Like, I don't think anybody's just a vegetable singing class. They just haven't lit up around it, and finding ways to say like, okay, where normally you would just be like a student that isn't doing the work or finishing the job, actually push you into a place where you can like even give input or feedback to other students on things. And that's another kind of recovery space, right? It's like saying like, hey, can I get a student to almost mentor or learn, and can we fit that? And it's easier in small classes, right? Those classes where you're like 10, 15 students. It's different than when I'm like, oh, I have 80, 90 students in a room and I have to get the disengaged student to show up and then also find out who they are inside, and then also see if I can find a way to plug them into the classroom. But yeah, those spaces where you can go like, all right, maybe one student's not comfortable in a brainstorming session because they don't just come up with ideas on the fly and they're not ready to just talk to a bunch of people about it. Is there another mechanism for feedback that works? And we say like, okay, well then we're going to try pairs for feedback in this kind of thing, or we're going to try more anonymous note stuff, or we're going to try the sort of like leaving comments on other people's posts, or we're going to talk about sort of like trying to feature or explore someone else's project. And all of those things work for different students. At Atlas, we have this huge expo that we run every year. And that's another big space for it, is going like, hey, students can take class projects and put them in the expo, which is awesome. They get several hundred people come through the building over the course of a couple hours and look at stuff and make introductions. It's become a big event. Students can also just take the projects that they kind of like made on their own while they were students here and enter those in the expo. We have people that are just have been like, I built a dirt bike frame and I'm going to show it off. I turned my van into a house van and I'm going to show that off at the expo. I made a weird thing. And that's another space where I see that kind of like feedback is maybe not quite exactly what it is, but it's providing spaces for students to show off what they're learning, regardless of whether it happened in your classroom. And as a result, they almost bring that work back into the classroom. They almost say, hey, I'm making this thing. Can I make this part of this class? Because it doesn't quite connect, but I really want to make a snowboard, or I really want to start a company around this cool thing that I found is my passion. And making room for that in a lot of different ways, whether it's big public exhibitions or whether it's sort of like flexing the requirements of an assignment to say, actually, yeah, as long as you can just put some graphic design work into this one, then yeah, your kind of like company building actually does fit this class. And letting that kind of happen is like make space for the things they're passionate about and try and formalize it a little bit so that it's still connected to class.
I mean, we're obsessed with evidence and documentation, and Unrulr is a tool for evidence and documentation and portfolio creation. Why do you think student portfolios are so important in this kind of work?
Well, I mean, for us, our whole program is like about people that are doing this thing we call like being a creative technologist, right? Which is kind of like saying everything. I mean, they leave and they do everything. But the degree program is pretty, I mean, maybe I'm showing the hand of the institute or higher education too much, but like there are students that leave here that are amazing. And there are students that leave here that don't really have a skill stack that would make them employable. And they both can leave here with the same degree. And in the world of saying like, I'm a creative person in particular, I'm a technologist that sort of does creative exploits. It's always a show me, don't tell me, right? And if students can't show off the work they've done, I say pictures or it didn't happen to every student, right? Because
100%.
Like, oh, I got it working. Yeah. And that's, I think as we get to where so many more of these sort of like base level creative functions, say like with AI and generative work there, like, it's not going to be just about whether you can say that you got a degree or you can make something or whatever. It's going to be about, or even just showing a thing that you made, months ago. It's more about this kind of like ongoing proof of process and that you're thinking about your creative outcomes and that kind of stuff too. Yeah. And that's,
you're speaking my language.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think
it's not about it. Yeah. Yeah.
It's process portfolios. It's evidence of growth. It's undeniable talent or capturing struggle, I think. That's what I'm really interested in. Well, not only with Unrulr, but just kind of learning in general.
Yeah, for sure. Now, students are, like you said, sometimes almost forced to think that the only thing that they can put out there is their polished, finished work. And I mean, I'm kind of horrible at documentation, to be honest. Like I'm so lucky if I sit down and even take any time, like, oh crap. And then I preach it to my students, like, don't be like me because my life is hard because I don't take enough. But at the end of the day, like it's better to have, some pieces of evidence along the way that you can kind of knit a story together with than it is to sort of wait until you have that perfect photo or video of the work that you did. And a lot of the time, sure, you compartmentalize it to where you have sort of like process blog work, and then you also have maybe a more polished, thing. If somebody only has a 30 seconds, yeah, you want to show them your best work. But if somebody actually wants to know who you are and what you're capable of, or better yet, they want to learn from what you did, then yeah, like it would be a tragedy for you to learn all these lessons through producing something cool, and then somebody else just have to like you muddle their way through it and learn the same lessons twice, especially like in our same program. I have that happen all the time where students are like, I don't know how to make this thing. And I'm like, oh, a student 4 semesters ago made that thing, but there's almost no record of it. So yeah, I guess you are going to learn it again. And yeah, sure, maybe learning is that, but it is nice to think of that sort of documentation and the artifacts we create, both as proof of what we're capable of and also as signposts for people to come after us. And I hope that students see themselves as part of that process too. We've pushed a lot of students to say, hey, you maybe didn't produce the thing you wanted to produce, but you sure learned a lot of ways to not do it and to be ashamed not to make that. So we have capstone finished thesis projects who literally like their presentation is, here's like 10 different ways that I didn't make the thing. Just a really well presented version of that, like 10 different ways not to make a light bulb, so to speak, is another way of showing the amount of work and learning that took place. And I'm all for those types of presentations too.
Yeah, I mean, the first class I taught was digital journalism, and the class was product based. I had learners take their capacities and skills and interests and marry them together to create products for themselves. And at every step of the way, I partnered them with subject matter experts in industry. I got really lucky. I started partnering them with people that run the Washington Post and Twitch and really cool companies, and then local nonprofits. And I was now a conduit. I was a facilitator between someone in industry who is now helping a student, and their relationship was centered around the product that the student was working on, right? It wasn't just a mentor who was like, here's how I got here. Like, it was like, I'm a consultant for you. I'm going to help you get this out into the world. There was one point in time where like the most famous science writer at the Washington Post was retweeting out a story that, the student I paired with her had written, right, that also became published. And then there was this beautiful relationship, right? And what I realized was that the product became this conduit to get their work out into the real world. But what I also realized was process needed to be enshrined just as much as that end product. And for them to understand the power of capturing process so that they could take the skills of doing that product and implement them throughout the rest of their life, right? That this was muscle memory. These were reps that they were putting in that would set that kind of creative competence too. Have you kind of seen that in your recent work as well?
For sure. Yeah. And the students that kind of integrate that into their rhythms early on are the ones that seem to thrive the most, kind of like, so like if they make that sort of like regular constant documentation of their work kind of integrated to what they do just because, which we try and enforce and reinforce at the very beginning of the program, like, hey, just you're going to set up a process document, you're going to kind of like create your blog or whatever it is, the format, that they're going to do better at the end of it if they can look back and go, oh, wow, I like actually really got something out of this, right? And those students really have a record, because we forget, like everybody forgets, student or other, like if you're in a formal educational environment or you're just a person who makes stuff. I mean, there's times when I go back through my photo records and I'm like, oh, wow, I forgot. I totally made this. I spent 2 months making this thing. And I like just, made it, installed it, took it down and forgot to even like do a good record of it. And that definitely happens with students who are, in 3 or 4 different project classes and they're all producing work and all those things. It's like, if you just make a rhythm of it, it makes a big difference. And yeah, it makes a difference for their ability to tell the story of what's my degree. Because there's always this question with a program that's just like creative technology and design. Students go, I don't know what that, people don't know what that means. And I'm like, that's not a bad thing, actually. It's not a bad thing to come out of a program where someone doesn't know who you are just based on the line of text next to your degree on your resume. That actually, if that was the case, you'd kind of have a boring life ahead of you, right? If you're like, someone looks at your resume and goes, oh, you have a degree in this type of engineering? Great, we're ready to go. I can put you in a cubicle and have you start making stuff right away. And we're kind of like against that idea of saying like, no, actually, you should have to explain it. And the more practiced you are at sort of telling and writing down that story as you go, the easier it's going to be to do that. When you said it's not going to feel unnatural or like somebody's interrogating you, it's going to feel like another opportunity to tell your story. And yeah, it just takes the development of that rhythm. But those students who make that a part of their kind of overall process and that usually have no problems getting a job because they're just used to explaining that in a way that feels authentic to them and doesn't feel like they're forcing, oh, here's my best work, please. We
Totally.
always want to do that, but there's some students that just nail it and some that struggle, and it's usually documentation's a good indicator.
Yeah, and that can be culture in a classroom. Like that can be building that out, setting the stage. What are you do a lot in the world of education, but also in the world of design and creativity. What are you really proud of? Like whether it's an interaction with the student, a thing you've created, or a program that you're running. And I don't want to say what are you most proud of, but like what are you really proud of in your work?
Yeah. I think one of the big things that I love is this experimental games festival that we run every year called the Whaaat Festival, which is just this place where we're trying to get, nailed it. Yeah. And we bring in, game designers and developers, but not that are working just in conventional industry usually, but people that are doing like strange, unusual, avant-garde games experiences, and we just almost trick students into coming in the room to be like, oh, you like video games, you should come to this conference. And they're like, oh, I like video games, I'm going to come. And then when they come in, everything is like, I didn't know that was a video game, or they feel weird or uncomfortable or excited, but surprised. And that, being able to curate an environment that isn't a traditional classroom, it's just sort of like a festival, and you really do come in and just play a bunch of weird video games and watch people talk about, odd game experiences, to me is like another way of building something. And I always, when I finished grad school, I was like, oh, I'm not going to teach. I'm going to, go and just make stuff all of the time. And I got to do that. But I realized after teaching for a little while that I was like, oh, actually teaching is design. Instructional design is a whole methodology that I think is a great problem to have to constantly solve and reinvent. And when you kind of zoom out of it and saying like, oh, actually my job is not just to, fill brains with information, but just to sort of generally make the things that I love and care about more approachable to more people so that they can come in and have those sort of like light bulb moments with them. That is just exciting to me. And that festival initially started with just me and another collaborator, my good friend, Matt Bethencourt, just saying, all right, what do we like that's weird? How can we get students to be slightly stranger with their approaches to games and design? And we realized a whole bunch of students then also had just never been invited to think about that. And if it was a class, they'd see it as like, oh, it's my obligation. But when it's sort of in this free form community environment, they're way more open to it. And we see so many students just like get excited.
Because there's choice there. There's choice there.
Yeah. They're not being forced to do it. There's no assignment to it. They're just like, oh, there's this cool games festival happening. And then they come in, and then those students that really click end up, a lot of them actually work in, games industry more conventionally now. But I think they were able to land those positions because they, were able to bring a less conventional approach to it. And that happened because their education, Atlas is cool in that they're like, yeah, we'll fund your weird festival, even though it's not like, driving a bunch of revenue or student enrollment or whatever, just because they kind of have bought into that idea that those things actually make the overall experience of education so much richer when there's just things that students can go and do in the background, even if they're not officially class or whatever. And yeah, every year I get excited about that, because also I just get to like pay cool people to come out and talk, which I'm like, oh, sweet.
It sounds amazing. I want to be there for it. I think, like, finally, there's two things I really grapple with. One is the status quo of education, which is, you know, it doesn't take a documentary to figure out. It's what we did in, post World War II, and it's what we're doing now. And then the other thing I really despise is when people are like, but this is possible 10 years from now. And it's like, screw you. We've been doing it for 100 years, and it's being done right now in all these classrooms. We're just not highlighting it and sharing it. And so many of the things that get in the way is we're not preparing middle schoolers and high schoolers for experiences like yours, right? You work with a cool group of people. I would love for you to work with 100 times that people, right? Like, maybe not you personally, but like the structures that you create to 100x that number. What skills, capacities, values would you plead with middle school and high school teachers to instill or foster in junior youth and youth in preparation for something like yours?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question. And
please just list like three.
Yeah. Yeah, no, please come up with an extensive thesis. No, I will say that there's a part of, like, when you're teaching in the university, there are these moments where you're like, oh, we're kind of getting them too late. Like the things that I want to show people, it's like, oh, I'm getting them a little late, right?
100%.
And yeah, one of them is that sort of like, obviously teachers are under a tremendous amount of pressure to sort of like hit benchmarks around test results and stuff like that, which is such a like painful thing to watch teachers go through. But to say, like, are there ways to remind students that like versions of failure are really actually welcome and important, right? Because I think a lot of the students that show up here have gotten this message that it's like, you have to make sure that you have this grade, otherwise you're not gonna do well. You're gonna fail at life, and if you can't get into a good college, your life is ruined. And I'm like, nope, that's not true. It's more about like whether you have this sort of mind that zooms out a little bit. So yeah, it's sort of like finding ways, if it was to help students feel comfortable with that failure and ambiguity, I think is a huge one. And then, yeah, I think the other side of it is that curiosity doesn't have to just lead itself to a end result. Like, you don't just have to engage curiosity for the sake of learning the thing to check a box, right? That like actually curiosity, hopefully, is this muscle that you have to flex. And then once you realize, you're like, oh my God, being a human being, getting to learn stuff is like basically one of the great privileges of consciousness. You're like, oh man, I am alive and awake and I get to learn new stuff. Like, what a cool, thing that I've just been given the gift of doing.
Flipping of a switch almost.
Yeah, it is. And any ways that, I think a lot of really great teachers really do make that their life's goal, is not to teach any particular thing, but just to say like, oh my gosh, can I get students to actually really enjoy just engaging the learning part of their brain? Because actually students will be fine if that thing's turned on. But yeah, doing so in a way that makes it feel like students realize they can apply that to anything, even things that aren't curriculum, right? And a lot of students come in here and it's like they've never thought that they would be able to run this tool, because they're like, oh no, tool, wood shop isn't for me, or I'm not a designer, I don't have an eye, or something like that. And it's okay to recognize that sort of deficiency, but to never to never say like, oh, this isn't for you, right? It's not for us to, as educators, to determine somebody's future. It's more just about helping those students realize that they can actually choose it, and that happens mostly by them just being willing to deal with the discomfort of being a learner. Learning's inherently uncomfortable, and that doesn't mean you're unsafe, right? It just means that you're like not good at something, and that can feel really scary for a lot of students I see coming to the university. They're like, oh, I can't separate this feeling of discomfort of being a bad, whatever, designer, maker, whatever, from this need that I have to be, at a certain level academically. And yeah, if we can find ways to divorce that to where students can just say, no, it's okay. I don't feel good about this, but that's actually what learning is. And actually, I really like what that is at the end, that I've learned something. And when you're doing like, whoa, that was really hard and weird and kind of uneasy, but I can measurably look at what I'm doing and see the result of it. It's exciting for me. And if there's any way we can get people to press that more, that'd be the thing for me, for sure.
Yeah, that speaks to why I became an educator. I mean, I think it's how do we teach and allow youth to thrive in uncertainty, right? And to be able to understand that life is uncertain and there's a power and beauty in uncertainty as well.
Yeah, it's like the whole. If there was, like an adult skill that you need, it's just dealing with ambiguity is the one.
Totally.
It's like go out there and have to and that should be what educational environments make really. This should be the best place for that, because it's like the safest place to fail. I think it's like a classroom should be that. And somehow we get away from that when we are too worried about outcomes. And if we can like fight for making classrooms that from early on, it's not just this place where you, have this sense of, a need to absorb something, but really just that it's like a, safe, like a tightrope with a net under it that you're like, I don't have to worry about it. I'm going to climb out here and see what my balance is like, and maybe fall a bunch of times, but that should be celebrated rather than discouraged.
Yeah. And I mean, yes to everything. And thank you so much, Danny, for this time. One of the worst things that we do to kids actually is we say that, right? We say we're going to celebrate it, and then we don't. We tell them to fail forward. Like every kid that I work with is like, you've been telling me to fail forward, but when I fail, you don't give me any grace in that experience. And so I just, education is full of hypocrisy, and I'm hoping that we can make it less.
Right. It's hard. Yeah. The structures that sort of sit behind teachers so many times like really undercut that, right? You're like, I want to try and tell students that this is true, but unless the systems that are like actually behind teachers support that sort of thing, then it is always going to be lip service. We're always only going to be like, I believe this thing, but you're in a system that's going to crush you. Sorry. But fortunately, students are not dumb, right? They're not ignorant of that. And if they can be prepared for it, honestly, without making them too simple, then they can also play a role in changing those systems by demanding more of that from the systems themselves, which is hopefully what teachers are able to do, is say like, hey, I can fight for you, but better yet, that's like teach a man to fish, but it's like teach a man to band together and teach a man to protest, and he'll get fired in a day, and teach a man to band together hundreds of people in protest, and he'll probably, I don't know, get fired in 100 days. I'm not sure what the metaphor is.